So it is my pleasure now to introduce Mike Rabo. He is a professor of clinical medicine at UCSF. He's an internist and a specialist in hospice and palliative care. He directs the symptom management service at the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. He has thought deeply and written a lot about palliative care, family caregiving, and care at the end of life. I'm particularly happy to introduce him because he has a lot of insight into how we deal with suffering toward the end of life, and also because his mom asked me to give him a big hug for his 19th anniversary, so I get to do that too.
So for years, my mom has been asking me to come down to LA to talk at our Temple education forum about palliative care, and it's never worked out, but she found Neil, so now she's totally satisfied. She doesn't need me anymore. So yeah, a few weeks ago, Judy called and asked me to do 10 minutes on suffering, which is sort of a routine part of my day anyway, so I figured it would be fine to bring it here. It's actually interesting, in light of Tony's session and the comments that it generated, it's nice to have a simple topic to turn to, which is suffering at the end of life. So I was going to spend maybe about 10 minutes talking about suffering and then open it up again for us to all think about it. And really the purpose of my talking about suffering really is to just introduce the topic, to bring the word into our discussions today and tomorrow. And ultimately, what I'm hoping for is that this is a chance for all of us to just begin over the next couple of days the process of deepening our own understanding of what suffering is. I think that we will not be experts at suffering by the end of these 2 days. We're really just, I think, hopefully going to be inspired to continue trying to understand it, trying to deepen our understanding of it. So let me start with what is suffering, the definition of suffering. In 1982, in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was a very, very pivotal piece published by Eric Cassell called The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine. And in some ways, what we're talking about today harkens back to trying to understand suffering as Eric did in '82. He wrote, "A distinction based on clinical observations is made between suffering and physical distress. Suffering is experienced by persons, not merely by bodies, and has its source in challenges that threaten the intactness of the person as a complex social and psychological entity. Suffering can include physical pain, but is by no means limited to it." So this idea about suffering is that it's a disintegration of parts of the self. And in this way, we can see how disease and illness can create suffering. Disease and illness, in many ways, creates loss. And loss leads to suffering. Really by virtue of, I think, creating, at least in part, a crisis of identity. I think that loss leads to this crisis of identity because we begin, through the things that we lose in illness, the things that we lose in the face of mortality, begin to question, begin to wonder about who we are, about our place in the universe. And so in this way you can see when you start to wonder about your place in the universe, you veered off into the land of spirituality and existential meaning. So we can ask the question, who are you if you don't have your hair? As many people with chemotherapy treatments don't have hair. Who are you if you don't have your breast? Who are you if you don't have your erectile function? Who are you if you don't have your concept of a future? Who are you if you aren't working, aren't able to support your family? Who are you if you are dependent on other people for things that you believed that you should be able to take care of yourself, your activities of daily living, driving the kids' carpool, your home finances, breathing, toileting. Yeah? Who are you if you don't have dignity or you don't have hope? Who are you if you don't have connection? Who are you if you don't have a sense of meaning in the world? So who is suffering? Where does this suffering reside? Obviously, we all appropriately focus on patients, on people who are doing the suffering, people at the end of life who are suffering from unbearable physical pain or emotional distress or social distress. People who are suffering from existential distress, what we're going to talk a lot more about, I know, during these next 2 days, issues of control and dignity. But there are others who suffer as well, and maybe that's some of us in this room too. Family, suffering from anticipatory grief, from guilt, from a sense of loss of control, from a fear appropriately placed in financial ruin. Staff and administrators who suffer grief, senses of failure and guilt, their own sense of loss of control, perhaps just anger about the extra work. And clinicians, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, social workers, psychologists, all of us clinical folks who suffer from anticipatory grief, from a sense of professional shame or guilt, a loss of control, anger about the extra work, and then guilt about that anger, yeah? Sense of abandonment. And I think for all of us to pay attention to our risk for burnout. Rachel Remen said, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." So what can medicine, what can healthcare, what can society do about suffering? So religious, I thought that was going to be the answer, shoot.
It was.
Some religious organizations will tell us that suffering is inevitable. It is part and parcel of life, or that suffering is necessary for salvation. Philosophers will focus on meaning. Viktor Frankl said, "Man is not destroyed by suffering, he is destroyed by suffering without meaning." And Nietzsche said something similar. "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." And medicine. What about medicine? Can suffering be cured? Obviously, there are some things that we can do. We can treat the vast, vast majority of pain. But there are many elements, many parts to being human that we don't have control over. We don't have control over mortality. We don't have control over bad luck. But we do have some role. Tony talked about, raised the question of the role of palliative care in ameliorating suffering. Ira Byock, here in the front row, said, symptom management, talking about palliative care, symptom management is our first priority, but not our ultimate goal. And we can circle back to Eric Cassell, who went on to say, the relief of suffering and the cure of disease must be seen as twin obligations of a medical profession that is truly dedicated to the care of the sick. Physicians' failure to understand the nature of suffering can result in medical intervention that, though technically adequate, not only fails to relieve suffering, but becomes a source of suffering itself. The twin obligations. So, has the law helped ameliorate suffering? Has it created suffering? Clearly, I think we're going to hear about both ends of that spectrum over the next couple of days. Clearly, the End-of-Life Care Options Act has relieved suffering for many patients. It's created some suffering too, I think. A definition of suffering from Howard Brody is, what ought to be whole is being split apart. And I think we can feel some of the split just in this room, let alone across our state and our country and our world. So my hope for this conference, I think most people's hopes for this conference, although it's not on the board yet, is that we'll improve the balance somehow between the costs and the benefits of the law in implementing it better and understanding it in a deeper way. And I will finish my comments with one last thought for all of us to consider as we move through these discussions, which was the point made so eloquently earlier by Lonnie, which is to remember that this is a death, that what we're talking about is the end of someone's life, the end of relationships, that what we're talking about here is grief. And we need to be mindful of that. Dr. Remen continued her quotation, "We burn out not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. We burn out because we have allowed our heart to become so filled with loss that we have no room left to care." So I wanted to just invite everyone to consider what suffering is and to consider this conference, this gathering, a chance for us to really rededicate and to honor the people that we serve. Thank you. So now we all have another 10 minutes or so, 5 minutes, to talk about suffering. Yeah.
I'm Catherine Forrest. I'm really intrigued by this as a family physician, by the parallels in so many ways of other places that there are suffering. And as someone who grew up in the era of the beginning of natural childbirth and assisting for pain through that major life transition and also the legalization of abortion, I'm really interested in what we can learn from the decision to support a birth plan with a death plan. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, so, I mean, I think that childbirth is sort of the classic example of the difference between pain and suffering. That childbirth, as painful as it is rarely described as an experience of suffering by women who have gone through it. The pain is severe, and we can focus on trying to treat the pain, to ameliorate the pain. But the sense of what's going on ends up having such importance to the woman and to those who love her that it really can transform the experience away from a simple process. People have talked about the difference between changing diapers of an infant and someone who's dying of end-stage Alzheimer's. And I think it's for all of us to struggle about how we interpret the meaning of what's going on and how that influences our behavior, including our behavior as clinicians.
I'm just thinking about one of the parallels is that I now have people who have never experienced the pain of childbirth who come in and they're interested in an epidural right now or planning a C-section. They're choreographing their birth within the range of options that have been accepted in the medical profession. And as I am stepping out into this world of the range of options at the end of life, it's taking a look at who am I to decide whether or not that person is suffering or not. It's their own experience of that collection of things. And sometimes it has to do with trauma. Sometimes it has to do with their own life experiences or their physical experiences. But it is an individual experience. And the question of what is the medical system's role in in having a non-judgmental approach to someone else's suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is really well taken. The very definition of suffering is one that is deeply personal, that has to do with someone's own sense. I think we mostly go through our days looking at people and saying, oh, you know, they're just a complainer, not a sufferer. And that's because of our judgment around what they're experiencing. So yes, I think that's a very important caution, given that the practicality of implementing a system where 2 or 3 or more people will get to decide whether or not someone is suffering or suffering adequately is inherently problematic. Yeah.
I think the other thing I want to comment on that, to extend it further, is that we need to be careful what our eyes see when we see someone, because looks are deceiving in all ways. So someone who may, to our eyes, look terrible, look in some way that invokes some kind of pain in us, may not be suffering at all. And similarly, people who look like they are at the peak of health may be suffering profoundly. And when we stop listening to them because they look too good, we kind of miss our opportunity to join them in their living. And I think suffering is kind of this pinnacle moment between living and not living. And I think that reminds us it's kind of like the top of the wave, and the only thing that works is to stay present.
I mean, I think that's a really important point to end on, which is that suffering, someone's expression of suffering, your sense that maybe somebody is suffering, is really an invitation to try and understand what's going on. I think maybe if everyone can try and remember that in the face of suffering, we'll do a much better job of understanding people, of being able to understand what it is they're experiencing. Because by definition, suffering is someone's inner lived experience, which we cannot tell from looking at them. I think one of the things that has some of the most vitriol that I've heard from patients is people who look good, who hate being told how good they look while they're at the end of their life with cancer. And so a reminder not to tell people they look good, unless you really understand how they're going to receive it. Because if they're going to like you saying that, then I'm all for it. But we need to understand each other in such a much deeper way. Yeah, thank you all.
Throughout this convening, but it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you 3 family members who have agreed to come and share their perspectives. We really wanted to start the panels with the voices of people who have been present at the end of someone's life who used aid in dying medications, in a way to remind us that the reason why we're here is precisely what Mike was talking about, is the humanity of this experience, and that these are losses of very important people to these women. And I want to acknowledge Kleenex, have it prepared for all of us. I want to make this an honest place to let the emotion that is likely to show up be felt by all of us, and to just make some beautiful space for these beautiful women and their stories. So with us on the panel is Jamie Alexis Newbold. She will be telling us about her father, Ralph Benner, followed by Barbara Coulter, who will be talking about her sister, Hillary Ann Smith Beasley, and finish with Sarah Dove, who will be talking about her husband, Dwayne Dove. We're going to give them each about 10 minutes. We're going to ask you to hold questions until each of them has spoken, and then we will welcome and engage conversation with each of you. Oh, sorry, one thing first. I had tasked them for 10 minutes, these are big stories, and so I had tasked them to think about these 4 items here, to offer us a snapshot of their loved one, because we focus so much on the last moments that we forget that these are people who have had full lives, and that these decisions are often in concert with who they were as people for their entire lives. So we've asked to talk about that, how this choice was a reflection of who they were. I've asked each of these 3 to share things they've learned as caregivers and partners in this process, And lastly, to give us one or two take-homes that they want each of you to hear today.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize to begin with because I had to write everything down. I'm going to have to read. Thank you for having me here and letting me share my story. And that's exactly what this is. It's my story. And my father, Ralph Eugene Benner, was born on January 4th, 1932. He was named after his father, who happened to be a doctor. And he was killed in a car accident about a month before my father was born because he was making a house call to a patient. My dad grew up as an only child with his mother until she remarried when he was about 10. And they moved from Illinois to Southern California. They moved to Pasadena. My dad went to UCLA. He was the social chair of his fraternity, Phi Kappa Psi, and he graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1954. From there, he worked for TV Guide and became the managing editor of Teen magazine in the early 60s, and then he became the original editor of Tiger Beat magazine, which featured articles on young music acts and celebrities like Bobby Sherman, Sonny and Cher, Donna Marie, David and Sean Cassidy, the Monkees, and the Jackson 5. He fostered and created teen idols until 1982 when he retired, and he began publishing his own magazine, Hollywood Studio Magazine, which turned into Hollywood Then and Now. He authored several books, including The Young Actor's Guide to Hollywood and Songbird, which was a book based on Sonny and Cher, and a book I was not allowed to read until I was an adult. My dad continued to interview musicians and entertainers well into his 70s, and he wrote freelance articles regarding the same. My dad was dynamic. He was fun. He always had a good story to tell. He loved to entertain and host annual Academy Awards and Golden Globes parties. Most of all, I apologize, he loved my mom, to whom he was married for 50 years, and he enjoyed living life to its fullest. Excuse me. From the time I was little, in the early 80s, I knew how my dad felt about illness and quality of life because of witnessing him care for his mother, my grandmother, who was painfully dying of lung cancer. He and my mom had to suction mucus and phlegm from her tracheotomy on a daily basis, several times a day, while she was bedridden and in severe pain, despite the hospice medications. She was nourished through a feeding tube, and she begged that this way of life be over because as far as she was concerned, she was not living. As long as I can remember, and was probably since my grandmother died in 1981, my dad had a book. It was a yellow-orange book, and it was titled, Let Me Die Before I Wake, Hemlock's Book of Self-Deliverance for the Dying. My sister and I called it the Hemlock Book. It was in our bookshelf in our living room, and he explained to us that if he ever got a terminal illness and was faced with suffering the way his mother was, that he would use this resource. It was very clear in our household that the decision about how my dad was going to die, if he was faced with an inevitable and miserable death, was not going to be made by the illness or the disease. His self-sufficiency, but more specifically his dignity, was of the utmost importance to him. Fast forward to my dad's diagnosis of incurable end-stage liver disease, his rapid decline, loss of appetite. Remember, he loved to cook. He even went to culinary school. His eventual loss of mobility and near total loss of independence, requiring 24-hour-a-day in-home care, combined with both a physical and emotional torture, heading down a path straight to loss of dignity. June 2016 couldn't have come soon enough for my dad to plead with his primary care physician to help him exercise the End-of-Life Option Act, which we actually called the Death with Dignity Act. His physician was not on board, and in fact indicated that my dad needed a psych eval. My dad couldn't get up and go to the bathroom, so try getting him to a psychiatrist's office, or try getting a psychiatrist to come to your house. My dad was ultimately referred to hospice, where he again voiced his desire to exercise the End-of-Life Option Act.
The head hospice doctor came and discussed this request with my dad at length, filled out paperwork, and he indicated that my dad was of sound mind and that he had less than 6 months to live. He seemed to be on board, but then explained that he needed to take this back to his hospice group and discuss it with them because they had never dealt with it before. And so he did, and they voted, and they decided not to participate. So that was roadblock number 2 for my dad. I remember coming home for Thanksgiving, and the Hemlock book was on the nightstand because he was so discouraged and so frustrated that he could not exercise the End of Life Option Act. My mom finally reached out to Compassion and Choices for help to see what other options there were, and thank goodness for that guidance, because my parents were able to connect with the most wonderful doctor. He was out of the area, not in my parents' medical plan, but he was willing to establish a relationship with my father. He traveled up to see my dad, spent time with him, and discussed my dad's request that he wanted to exercise the End of Life Option Act. My dad was dying. He was no longer living. He was existing, and that was not what he wanted. He never wanted to be doped up on morphine or Haldol or Adderall or whatever the other hospice drugs he was given. There was a refrigerator filled with them. He wanted to live because he loved life so much, but this was not living to him. So ultimately, all of the hoops that were required to be jumped through were jumped through, and my dad was able to control his own destiny before it was too late. And he passed away on December 22nd, 2016, at the age of 84. He was surrounded by myself, my mom, my sister, 2 nieces, a dear friend of ours, my dad's caretaker, and the compassionate doctor that my parents were finally able to find. That day was certainly life-changing for me. I had been exposed to death before. I witnessed my sister-in-law die in the hospital through a very painful death at the age of 51. But I think that how peaceful this process ended up being was so reassuring to me. Another thing that was reassuring and comforting for me was that my father had gotten to a point where he was having a hard time swallowing and could barely drink water with a straw. And when I saw the 2 cups filled with the slurry that he was going to drink, I thought, oh no, I don't know if he'll be able to do this. But without hesitation and pure determination, my dad drank down that first dose with no problem, and same with the second one. So I knew that his choice was the right choice. It took about 10 minutes from the time he started drinking the second slurry until his heart finally stopped. It was peaceful, and it was a relief. And you could feel his angst, torture, and suffering leave the room. So to leave you with something to take away from my experience is, I hope there is more guidance, a better way for someone in my parents' position to be able to navigate the system. I understand, or it's my understanding, that Kaiser has a system. My parents weren't members of Kaiser. And for my dad, the clock was ticking, and each day that passed was one more day closer to his inability to be able to make the decision about his death on his own. So thank you for letting me share my story, and I hope you gain a little nugget of something from it.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. Again, and thank you for letting us speak today. It means a great deal to me, and I know to the other 2 ladies. I too am going to read, because I would go off on a tangent. You can ask Helene. It was 2.5 hours when I did the interview. My sister is Hillary Ann Smith Beasley. My sister was smart and funny and irreverent and caring and serious. Hillary looked for and most times saw the perfect moment in every day. We weren't twins, but many thought we were. We sounded so alike that if they didn't see who was talking, even our family members couldn't tell the difference. That was fun, calling our husbands on the phone. I can't now when I don't see us in the videos. Hillary was a cowgirl. She raised cows and turkeys and chickens on a small plot of land, and she was an accountant and a photographer and a painter and a writer, but there was nothing accountant beige about her. She was a lover of books and family and dogs and cats and any living creature. She'd pick up snakes and tarantulas and baby birds and cared for anything that needed her care. Hillary loved the ocean, and when she was the financial director for the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, she was crew on the tall ship Pilgrim, 92 feet in the air in the middle of the ocean as the mast captain. We were all raised Catholic, but in Hillary's later years, she called herself a Christian. Hillary believed that God was not a mean God, that he did not want to see people suffer. When I asked her if she was getting excited about seeing our parents and our brother and all the dogs and cats that had gone before her, she said yes and added, and I'll see Jesus too. She was diagnosed on July 8, 2016 with ovarian cancer. She moved in with my husband and me on July 17th. We both knew, she and I and he, that she would need care and a place to heal. The adventure, as Hillary called it, began, and there was no talk of end of life. In fact, she didn't even know that this was a law that existed. She had surgery at UCI on July 27th, and the pathology came back showing stage 4 colon cancer. Chemo started in September 2016, and she continued telecommunicating for her job, the nonprofit. A CT PET scan in November showed remission, and everybody was happy, the oncologist was happy, and we celebrated. She continued her chemo, and the fall and the winter of that year was about life, going to parties and plays, enjoying family visits. She worked on her stamina and walked almost every day, rain or shine. We took hikes in the wilderness areas near our home. She was so thrilled the day she walked 4 miles with me on a very tough trail. We celebrated birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, all very important to her. But a CT scan in January showed metastasis to the liver. The chemo stopped, per the oncologist, and Hillary had her second major surgery on February 21st of this year. But the surgeon saw too many lesions, so a 4-hour scheduled surgery became 1 hour. The choice given, aggressive chemo, to add maybe 4 months to Hillary's life. Hillary's choice, organic and juicing and another sister project, learning to eat completely differently. She made this change in a day. She really wanted to live, but she wanted to have quality of life as well. We made a road trip to Arizona in April and a sister trip to Hawaii in May. She took walks and photos and enjoyed life and continued to see the perfect moment in every day. When the pain and other aspects of the cancer got to be too much, on June 27th, Hillary chose hospice. She also chose to take advantage of the End of Life Option Act. Hillary had made the decision to have quality of life. Now she decided to have quality in death as well. Why? She wanted to die with dignity. She wanted control over her how and when. She was unwilling to accept the unacceptable suffering of colon cancer beyond just pain, and she believed that God did not want to see her suffer. This all took bravery and a pioneering spirit. You have to be brave to choose the End of Life Option Act, and Hillary was very brave. We started the process of finding a doctor in Orange County. I knew this would be difficult because I had been researching the End of Life Option Act and found access was limited. I called my family doctor, who referred me to his colleague. He also said that he would be the second physician. Hillary was able to see the doctor on June 29th. He talked to her, he confirmed her diagnosis, and the process began. He had told us that he was the only one doing this in Orange County, that of the 111 participants at that time, 6 had been his patients. He also said that this was the most rewarding doctoring he had ever done. My doctor met with her on July 3rd and went through the process again, but before that, he said that he had had to consult his Episcopalian bishop because he was a religious man. And the Episcopalian bishop told him that the church at that time had no opinion. So we went through the questions in the process and he signed. On July 14th, Hillary visited the first attending again, and again he followed the process. The final form was signed. He then said, now my job is to find a pharmacy that will dispense the 4 medications. On July 17th, the pharmacist called and spoke with Hillary, who gave him permission to allow me to pick up the medication. It was a scary and anxious moment for me, and I had to wait some time before I could drive home. I had 4 medications in my possession, one of which would end my sister's life. Also, I had just handed the clerk at the pharmacy a check for almost $5,000. We knew the price would be exorbitant, but I was still stunned. I drove home, and Hillary looked at the bag and the bottles, and she put them in a brown paper bag, stapled it, and put it in a drawer. Neither Hillary nor I wanted to see this bag. We knew what its power was. It came out only once before she took the drugs, and that was to show the hospice nurse what they were. My brother came to visit that week, and after the pain meds and acid reflux meds were finally having the desired effect, Hillary was able to enjoy his visit, talk to him more about her decision, reminisce with us about life, laugh and love, and to continue to take as many photos as possible, mostly hummingbirds. Because Hillary was starting to have swallowing difficulty due to the cancer, she knew she would have a limited amount of time before she would need to take the aid in dying medications. She talked to me about timing. She practiced drinking 4 ounces of liquid to make sure she could do it. She found that she liked the taste of vanilla, honey chamomile tea, so she decided to mix the Secanol with that. On July 26 at 1 p.m., Hillary started the process. My sister put on a beautiful sea blue dress and her favorite earrings and the sister bracelets we bought in Hawaii. She had decided to have the hospice nurse and social worker in the living room with my husband. She only wanted me in the room. It was harder than we thought to empty those capsules, and I was anxious. And she told me everything would be okay, because she always worried about me. She said the mixture tasted earthy. We sat and held hands and talked, and she said her vision was getting blurry. We each said, "I love you," and she told me I gave her a wonderful year, and she went to sleep. Hillary died at 2:15 p.m. Our takeaways? Access is limited. Access is limited. Support, don't question, as this is not the time to make this human being, this loved person, explain themselves beyond the fact that they made this decision. They shouldn't have to work to convince anyone else. Please don't call it assisted suicide. It is not. My sister wanted to live, and I hope I've shown you that. Share everything, because the decision's already made, and the need to share is there for you and your loved one. Don't share with others unless they want you to. My husband was so comfortable he was sharing it with everyone. She said, no, just wait till I'm gone. Laugh, cry, respect. Be there, but respect your loved one's wish as to who they want with them at the end. Hold hands, talk, say goodbye, share with others, as I promised her I would do, as the message about quality of life and quality in death is one of the most important things we as humans must continue to strive for. At Christmas, I gave my sister a statue of 2 women together, and the card said, "My sister, my friend, walk with me, and along the way, we'll share everything." And we did. She was 61 years young. Thank you.
Dwayne was a very handy person. He could do electrical work, plumbing, build decks, lay floors, fix the car, anything and everything. He especially loved using a chainsaw, and he cut all the wood that we needed to heat our house in the winter. He was known to be so skilled at using the chainsaw, in fact, that he could balance on one limb of a tree and use both arms to hold the saw to cut the limb above. The rest of us thought this was a bit foolish, but he was somewhat of a risk taker, always pushing the envelope to the very edge. And he was a stubborn man who did things in his own very carefully calculated way, and we rarely convinced him to change his mind on anything. Being scientifically trained, Dwayne was highly analytical, methodical, deliberate, never used intuition, like I do, to make decisions. Facts and solid research were always the basis for his decision-making. He served as faculty rep for the faculty union at Sonoma State University and likely knew the details and intricacies of that contract better than anybody in the state of California. He was also the faculty athletic rep, which required him to know CCAA and NCAA rules in detail. He was well known and respected for standing up for students and for faculty, for representing them both fairly and always ensuring that due process was met. As a PhD, Dwayne read widely. He knew how to generate, organize, analyze data with integrity. He stayed current on new information and trends in his field. He was originally an experimental psychologist, but after a couple of postdocs, that morphed into industrial psychology, and he taught at Sonoma State mostly labor law, human resources law, organizational behavior. His brother died of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis in February of 2013, and Dwayne was diagnosed in August of that same year with that same disease. Dwayne was surprised and disappointed that his brother had not explored treatment options or gone beyond the local rural doctor for his care, and this made Dwayne even more determined to take a different route for himself. He began researching, he explored clinical trials. His pulmonary doc connected him with a specialist and support group at UCSF, and he actually engaged in some of those clinical trials, taking the drug pirfenidone, for example, off and on for a couple of years, which was initially thought to have some efficacy in extending the life of IPF patients. Having served as chair of the Institutional Review Board for all research done on human subjects at Sonoma State, he knew the lingo, the laws, the protections inside and out. He was able to get through all the legalese of those clinical trials, and therefore he made decisions to become part of those trials with great care and solid judgment. True to his nature, he doggedly pursued options that might prolong his life, which he valued greatly. He was determined to stay on this earth with his family for as long as he could, and he did all he could to make that happen. Family was first and foremost for him, and that love for and loyalty to us was a constant motivator to keep living. Choosing to partake of the EOLO was simply one of the choices he explored. It was a tool in his toolkit that might be needed in the end. It was a safety net, a backup which he might need. He made the decision to get the drugs with great care, a huge sense of responsibility and gravitas, but he did not know if he would ever take them or not. They were in the house if he needed them, but they were a last resort. When the Kaiser pharmacist and EOLO program coordinator came to our home to deliver the medicine and explain the procedure for taking them, I almost did not open the door. It took all my strength and determination to let them in. This was it. The moment had come. Even though I knew that Dwayne might never take the drugs, that they were a safety net for him, the delivery of those drugs was chilling. As his spouse, however, I felt that the greatest gift I could give Dwayne then was support to do what he wanted to do, to not question his decision. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life, to receive drugs that could end my husband's life. I took comfort in the fact that the choice he made was made with care and reasoned judgment. I knew in my heart and soul it was the right thing to do, and I did it. I cannot emphasize enough that the decision Dwayne made to end his life on his own terms was not taken lightly. Dwayne had heart disease in addition to IPF, and his liver was compromised by the pirfenidone. He feared having a stroke and being bedridden for the rest of his life. He fought hard to live, but he did not think he should have to die as his brother had died, with a persistent, deep, and extremely painful cough that could not be alleviated by drugs, and a body so swollen from prednisone that he was almost unrecognizable. He also did not want to lie in bed, as 3 of our parents had done for months and even years, with no cure for their illnesses, but having to end their life in unalleviated pain. Lastly, he had watched the horror of a family friend struggling with Lou Gehrig's disease before the EOLO Act was passed in California. It is extremely sobering to opt for the end-of-life drugs. It's not a decision that's made lightly or in haste. I also want people to know how grateful my family and Dwayne were for the EOLO Act. It passed in June, and Dwayne took the drugs in November. We were extremely fortunate that Dwayne could do what he did legally and with dignity. On his last day of life, Dwayne was able to Skype his 2 sons, one in Edinburgh, Scotland, one in Miami, to say their last goodbyes. Our daughter was able to be present for his death. Dwayne had waited all day for me to finally reach her by phone at the end of a day of hiking in Marin County. She raced up to our home in Santa Rosa and spent the last moments of Dwayne's life with him. Barely responsive all day, fatigued beyond measure, and unable to get sufficient oxygen, Dwayne took the cocktail at the end of the day. He reached out, grabbed it, and swallowed it with conviction. I believe that Dwayne, being the risk taker he was, pushed himself to the very limit before he ingested the life-ending drugs. His body was completely spent, worn out. The last card he had to play was controlling his ending before a potential stroke or something worse, and he played that card with quiet determination and dignity. One of Dwayne's doctors called me the day after Dwayne's death and told me that his own mother had died of IPF. The family had been at her bedside when she struggled at the end, crying out in pain and in agony. Their memory is of a gruesome death. Our memory of Dwayne's death is not a happy one, of course, but we are fortunate that he did not struggle or experience pain. His death was peaceful, quick, and beautifully calm. He simply went to sleep.
We welcome your questions or comments.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Bob Uslander. I practice in San Diego. And along with Lonnie, I think I'm one of the physicians who has the most experience in this realm. I was the physician that helped Jamie and her family. I was there with Ralph when he died. Interesting coincidence. So the question that I would like to ask, I wanted to discuss this a little bit in the last session, but there wasn't time. We talk about suffering, and there's many different forms of suffering, and the suffering that I see people experiencing in large part is the suffering that comes with not knowing how you're going to die and looking toward a potentially agonizing, very struggle at the end of life. So what I'd like you guys to share, if you could, if you're open to this, is the sense of struggle that your loved one experienced prior to being assured that this process was going forward, or in a couple of cases, having access to the medication between the time that they actually got it and ended up taking it. Do you have a sense of how that impacted their sense of the timbre or tone of their life and their sense of kind of struggle with that in that time frame? Am I being clear? From the time they got the prescription, or at least were assured that they were entering the process, until they actually took it, what was the change that they experienced?
I'll really quickly just say, because my father had such a difficult time having that process start, once the process did start and that there was that 15-day waiting period, there was relief and calmness and almost like a light at the end of the tunnel, and the angst and the had been relieved a lot. But up until that time, it was consistent emotional suffering, basically, because of the unknown, like what you said.
From the time my sister got the medication, again, she was relieved. Just like when she went on hospice, she felt as though she had somebody to call if she had any issues. So when she did get the medication, she felt like, okay, I have control now. I can take a deep breath and exhale, because she knew, in talking to the oncologist and the nurse, exactly what was going to happen as this colon cancer continued. She also hadn't been able to eat anything but a half a cup of applesauce twice a day for the last 2 weeks prior to that. And so and the pain was getting worse and worse, and the acid reflux, she would sleep with a towel sitting up. So when she got this medication, she felt a relief knowing, now I have control over what's going to happen to me going forward.
I don't think that Dwayne knew that he was going to even take the drugs till about 2 days before he took them. And I think he continued to do his research and talk to his doctor, and always thought that there might be something that would keep him alive longer. So it wasn't until the very last moment, when he had a very rapid decline in his health on a Friday, that he asked me on Saturday, do you think I should take the drugs? And that was the first time that that question had ever been asked of me, as if it was now going to happen. So it was a very quick decision for him to do that, always holding out hope.
So it sounds like there were 3 very different experiences up there. So good job of getting a wide range of people. And that's one of the things that I've recognized is the sense of struggle that some of these people, the relief of that. And there's a few people that I can specifically think of, and one of them is a gentleman with ALS. And those folks live with this fear that at some point the condition is going to tip to the point where they will no longer be able to do anything. They won't have any use of their limbs. They won't be able to swallow. So there are a couple of folks in that realm who once they had access, and it was either at the pharmacy or on the shelf, their life was it was a different experience. They didn't have to live with the same amount of fear that they were typically living with. So I just wanted to share.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Paula. I do work for Kaiser. I'm an ethicist in Southern Cal. I have a question, actually, for all of you. Did any of you feel judged by your own communities, or those people who you are with? And if you could, if that happened, can you talk about that and how you've moved through it?
Yes, I'm pretty transparent. My sister did not agree with my dad's decision, although she was supportive, so she was there. One of the questions she asked me, well, how are you going to take off work? Are you going to tell them that you're taking bereavement? And so that was hard. But I did, because this was available, and thank God it was for me. It's been, a secret as far as my sister is concerned because of being judged. So that was my experience.
I was fortunate. Our friends and my husband and my brother were very, very supportive. They asked a lot of questions, which I was willing to answer after Hillary had passed. They were very, very supportive. So we were very grateful for that. And everybody knows that I'm here today talking about it. So, I thank God for that being the case.
No judgment at all from the medical community. All very supportive and made it an easy process for us. We chose not to tell people who we thought might judge us. And so it was a limited amount of people who knew it was going to happen. And afterwards, I have told few people as well. I don't want to engage in a discussion at this point in my life about whether that should or should not happen. And it's such an intimate decision. And, you know, I would not have had the party like the fellow did in the, whatever that Atlantic Monthly or whatever that thing was. My husband wouldn't have had that either. It's too close to your heart, and not something you just share simply.
You have the last question.
Wonderful. First, thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing your stories, and to you for collecting all of these wonderful stories for us to learn from. My name is Matt Whitaker. I'm with Compassion and Choices, and so my question is around the access piece that was brought up. You know, Jamie, you talked about how you ultimately had to go to an advocacy group to get the support that you needed. And Barbara, it sounds like your sister was very lucky to have you as an advocate there who was working through all these pieces. I wonder, Sarah, if you could share how things differed for you with your husband being in a healthcare system where they had a system in place for dealing with these requests and not having to go kind of in that direction.
Well, it was just easy. He went to an appointment with his doctor one day, and his doctor hadn't seen him for a while and was shocked at how Dwayne's appearance was and how his pulmonary function tests were going downhill. And but Dwayne, you know, followed the media, knew it was happening, and brought up the question about the EOLO, and the doctor simply explained the process and talked about getting the okay from his pulmonary specialist as well. And Dwayne did exactly what he was supposed to do according to the letter. So it was very well laid out at Kaiser, very simple to do. We were impressed by the fact that the pharmacist and the program coordinator came to our home, which was very special. Two wonderful people who were very gentle and were there to make it easy for us. So every step of the way was laid out and executed well. And I will never forget the doctor calling the very day after and asking how it had gone, and I was blown away by how attentive he was and the care that he showed us. Very special.
We would like to honor you all in honor of Ralph, in honor of Hillary, in honor of Dwayne.